Shifting funeral practices. Could ecologically friendly death care be the future of the American funeral industry? Some key definitions that we'll be covering are death care, the products, services, and arrangements having to do with the disposition of human remains. Embalming, the preservation of the deceased from decay, in which all bodily fluids are removed and replaced with a preservative. Burial, the process of placing the deceased in a casket and then in the ground, often in a burial vault or grave liner to preserve the casket and maintain level grounds. Cremation, the process of breaking down a deceased individual's remains using intense heat so that all that remains are ash and bone. The American business person consumer model of death care allows for Americans to more easily personalize their funerals than in other countries. An analysis of this model of death care practices reveals how American consumers are more actively seeking ecologically friendly funeral options, including products, services, and arrangements. Could ecologically friendly disposition practices replace environmentally damaging practices of old? We certainly hope so. A brief history of the modern American funeral. In 1861, Queen Victoria publicly mourns loss of her husband, Prince Albert. She does so by wearing black, which quickly becomes all the rage across the UK and America. The Industrial Revolution. Individuals begin to move into larger population centers. Individuals are dying faster than local churches can handle, and cemeteries are being built further outside of town. All of these are removing funerals from the home. So the government assigned 3 different types of people to handle human remains outside of the home. These are the business people, as found in America, the municipal official, as found in UK, and the clergy, found across the world. Civil War and Lincoln both popularized embalming. Embalming was used in the Civil War to help bring soldiers home to their loved ones. When Lincoln died, he was embalmed and placed on a train that took a 12-day journey across the United States for people to view his lifelike body. These 2 events popularized embalming and preserved its place in modern death care. The notion of a beautiful death arose from this popularization of embalming. Now that public grieving, embalming, and tailoring funerals to match one's identity were now possible, this created the notion of a beautiful death. In 2005, Walter suggested that the purpose of this notion was to create a beautiful image for mourners, displayed with a fine casket bedecked with flowers. This lovely idea that a person is sleeping. A beautiful death isn't a uniquely American experience, but our model has allowed for the opportunity to personalize a funeral. In countries where clergy or municipal officials deal with the disposal of the deceased, funeral rites tend to be less personalized and more toned down than the American funeral. Being able to personalize a funeral for mourners has not always been beneficial to funeral workers or the environment, as we will discuss in this next section. Ecologically friendly options. So, typical studies done in this area include discussing the impact of embalming on the environment, the large amounts of lands and resources used in traditional burial, and the negative impacts of cremation on both funeral workers, their health, and also the release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Modifications to modern funeral practices. Embalming is now frequently insisted upon for most viewings. The most common embalming compounds are made with formaldehyde solutions, which are toxic to both workers and can contaminate the water and ground after burial if the coffin leaks. Alternatives include cremation, immediate burial, or preserving the body in a refrigerator until it is ready to be buried. Burial or cremation. These are the 2 most common methods of disposal of the deceased. Burial. Burials are resource intensive. They use thousands of tons of steel, copper, bronze, wood, and concrete annually. They're also financially intensive. A funeral can cost over $10,000. Extensive land use, chemical fertilizers, and high fossil fuel use through the intensive maintenance of these memorial parks. Cremation. It was once considered a pauper's burial choice due to lower cost than burial. It averages between $1,500 and $3,000, but cremation has gained popularity over the years. Over more than half of Americans who died in 2021 were cremated, which is a change from the year before, where just below half of Americans were cremated. Cremation uses fewer resources than burial. However, it does use greater use of fossil fuels and electricity. Unfortunately, toxic chemicals such as mercury and greenhouse gases can also be emitted in the process. Alternatives to modern funeral practices. Some alternatives include aquamation, composting, natural cemeteries, ecologically friendly burial containers, eternal reefs, backyard and home burials, sky burials, tree burials, and a mushroom suit. Aquamation, aka hydromation or alkaline hydrosis, only legal in 19 states. While this process still uses chemicals and heated water to break down the human remains, it can do so in as little as 3 to 4 hours. Yes, that still does use energy to heat the water, but it significantly cuts down on land use, fossil fuels, and the release of hazardous chemicals. It also leaves behind bone and a harmless mixture of amino acids, peptides, sugars, and soap that may be disposed of in a regular sewer system. This process averages between $2,000 and $3,000. Unfortunately, it is not very popular because it was originally used on deceased livestock. Human composting. Human composting consists of placing human remains in a stainless steel container along with wood chips, alfalfa, and straw, where the remains naturally break down. The process takes between 6 to 10 weeks and produces 1 cubic yard of soil per human body. Presently, it is only legal in 3 states, and it costs between $4,000 and $5,000, so one of the more expensive options. Natural burial is where the deceased is buried without first being embalmed in a biodegradable coffin, urn, or shroud. Natural burials are often done in natural cemeteries. The most popular natural death care option in the United States, with over 162 natural burial sites across all 50 states. It costs between $1,660 and a little over $5,000. Other ecologically friendly death care options. These include eternal reefs. The cremated remains of a loved one are mixed with environmentally safe cement and placed at sea. Home burials or backyard burials, which is the process of burying a loved one on private property. Sky burials, which is not legal in the United States but popular in Tibet, is where the deceased is placed out in the open, allowing the elements and birds and animals to return a loved one's remains to nature. Natural containers. There are endless varieties of natural containers, including caskets and urns made from wicker, cardboard, paper, simple wood. Tree burials. The deceased remains are used to help grow a tree. And mushroom suit. The deceased is placed in a literal suit of fungi to aid in decomposition. Green death care isn't new, but is something that has become popularized within the last 10 years. Funeral directors are beginning to embrace Americans' choices to create individualized funerals that represent their environmentally friendly ideals. The National Funeral Directors Association of 2022, a consumer awareness and preference report, found that 60.5% of individuals interviewed would be interested in exploring green death care options. Factors impacting choice of ecologically friendly options. There are 5 major factors that play a role in the disposal of their remains or their loved ones' remains. The first is one's religion or lack of religious belief. That can play a huge role on whether the person involves the church in their options for their burial, the way that they're buried, Presently, the Catholic Church does not allow for human composting, as it says that it goes against their religion, is one example. What state a person resides in is the second major factor, and this can help play a role in, for instance, if somebody's in a landlocked state, sea burial is not going to be as friendly of an option as, say, someone in Florida. What options they have available to them. Presently, several of these ecologically friendly burial options are only available in a few states. Human composting is available in Oregon, Washington, and I believe California. As somebody from Florida, human composting really isn't an option for me unless I want to pay a lot of money to get my body shipped, which leads us to factor number 4, what an individual can afford. As we've discussed, many of these burial practices range highly in pricing, from relatively inexpensive to, oh my goodness, you're going to have to take out a second loan on your house for those. And so it really depends on what an individual can afford on how they're going to be buried. Finally, major external factors such as war, natural disaster, COVID, and more can play a role in how someone is buried. There was an Ebola outbreak a few years ago in Africa, and all individuals were required to be buried in plastic bags, which, again, changes the way that certain religions and certain people are able to deal with death. Some future options. So there are some gaps in the literature. The literature appeared to be overwhelmingly Western-centric, possibly due to the fact that the search results were only done in English. Very few other countries use the business person consumer model of handling human remains, such as America does. As I mentioned previously, the UK uses the municipal official, and other countries within Europe also use the municipal official or the clergy to use their burial practices. Additional limitations include most of the literature related to natural burials comes from the UK, where they started doing natural burials in 1993. So, United States, natural burial is still relatively new, and we don't have as much information on it. In individuals whose loved ones were interred at natural burial sites, definitely felt a lack of closure because of the unmarked graves, and they also felt constraints on their mourning experience due to the strict rules and regulations of these burial sites. For instance, they weren't allowed to leave trinkets on their loved one's grave. While American business person model of handling arrangements for the deceased isn't certainly without its issues, it does give Americans the unique experience of being able to create funerals that represent their values. It is through this market-based lens that we can view an increasing success on expanding options within the ecologically friendly death care market. Switching to more ecologically sustainable funeral options, Americans can both celebrate the memory of their loved ones and help protect the planet for future generations. By making minor changes, such as switching to compostable urns, changing the chemicals that are used in embalming to create more environmentally friendly options, or choosing to be cremated rather than buried, resources, land, and the environment can be preserved. Although ecologically friendly funerals are not always less expensive, as we've seen in these slides, than their traditional counterparts, they do tend to focus on minimalism and cut back on the extra expenses found in traditional funerals, such as burial vaults, pillowy coffin liners, and other add-ons. Based on the statistics discussed, America is moving in a more ecologically friendly direction in the death care industry. With science and technology proving every day, there are bound to be innovations in safer chemical embalming, new forms of ecologically friendly cremation, further legalization of human composting across the 50 states, and hopefully we will have more creative solutions for the use of land, sea, and space for future death care.